Well, good evening, and thank you to everybody for coming along. We're joined by the authors, as you know, of two books, one being published next week. The other's been out for over a year. They're both on the subject of Ireland and Catholicism. They're very different in approach. Both offer some very useful and interesting observations on the Church in Ireland, just 10 years short of 16 centuries of Christianity on this island. 1932, as many of you will know, was a landmark year of celebration. But you'd have to wonder now, what will there be to celebrate in 2032, and who will be around to do the celebrating? That's something we'll consider in our conversation this evening with Mary Kenny and Derek Scally. Nearly 60 years in journalism. I think it's fair to describe Mary as a veteran in the trade, or profession, as some people prefer to describe it. She has seen and written and said a lot, much of it indeed relating to the Catholic Church in Ireland. She was a crusading woman's editor of the Irish Press newspaper long ago. She's now a columnist, among other things, in the Irish Catholic. Her new book is called The Way We Were, Catholic Ireland since 1922. It's a wonderful read, and it's a book of two halves. The first half is about that subject. The second half consists of, I think it's 10 profiles of people who've been prominent and who Mary has known very well. She's done some really interesting profiles of them. People like Gay Byrne, Mary Lavin, Frank Duff, Delia Murphy, Peter Sutherland, Deirdre O'Connell, Sean McRaman, and many more, finishing with Sean McBride and Ken Whittaker. Derek Scally is too young to be called a veteran, even though he's been a journalist for, I think, at least a quarter of a century, mostly as German correspondent of the Irish Times. His book, The Best Catholics in the World, which I've no doubt many of you will have read, has been on the shelves for I would say, well over a year. And it's been widely praised for its sharp observations gleaned during a series of reflections and engagements during several return visits to Ireland. Our theme, as you know, is Proud Legacy or Shameful Debacle. Perhaps it's both. So much to talk about. And I was hoping perhaps to start by getting a sense from both of you about your own relationship with Catholicism, the phases it's gone through, and what that relationship is like now. How would you characterize it? Is it friendly, angry, disillusioned, hopeful, whatever? Mary, you're first.
Okay. Well, I have to say I do identify with Liz Truss in one thing. She keeps changing her mind. And I don't think, some people think that's frivolous. I think that's about growth and learning and having experiences and having new perspectives and revising things. And I grew up in Sandymount in Dublin, and I was a very rebellious young woman. And I thought my father died when I was young, but I thought my elders were absolutely hopelessly stuffy Victorians. And naturally, the natural function of the young person is to rebel against their elders and to overturn the old regime. That was quite that's what you're there for, in a way. You've got to bring some fresh thinking to the world. And I was a pioneering feminist in the early 70s. I was a founding member of the Irish Women's Liberation Movement, and I was very, very wild and sometimes very drunk. And so I've been through a lot. And after that, I got married and had 2 children, just about in that order. And so life suddenly struck me in a much more serious way when I became a mother, and that there was more, that you couldn't really just, it's not all about sex and drugs and rock and roll. And so, that's been part of my journey. And I suppose I would say I like the way the Jews talk about being an observant Jew. We talk about being practicing Catholics, but I like the idea of being observant. I'm an observant Catholic. I've blown hot and cold with the faith over the years, but it's never let me go, and it is very important to me. And it's been a very nourishing thing in my life, and also it's been something which I feel has expanded my imagination and my my journey of reflection and also my intellectual learning to a great degree as well. So I'm very grateful for it. But of course, I'm also aware, as we learned in our Penny Catechism, that, you know, we're all flawed, and plenty of us are very flawed, and one has to see that is that's the way it is. So I think of myself as an ecumenist as well. I believe that Christians and also especially Jews, whom I look on as very much as the root of our faith, have so much in common to talk about, and to talk with atheists, humanists, Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus, everybody else as well, because there is, you know, as they say in Alcoholics Anonymous, it's good to identify with the similarities and not just the differences.
Mary, thank you. You mentioned about practicing Catholic. It reminds me of that line, I think it's in Paul Durkin's A Christmas Day. Are you a practicing Catholic? Yes, I practice and I practice and I practice and eventually I get to play. Derek.
Yes, thank you very much for everyone for coming along, and thank you to Columba and to Mary for this generous invitation. My book has been out a while, some of you may have read it, but I can honestly say Mary's book, I said to her the other evening, Mary, I'm not sure, it's like a good wine, should you savour it or just knock it back all in once? It's a real compulsive read, and I really encourage you all to have a look in there, above all for the breadth of knowledge, but also the generosity to people of the opposite side of a debate who perhaps wouldn't have been as generous to Mary. My own faith, to quote the line, I used to be indecisive and now I'm not sure. In the book I talk about myself as a grappling Catholic, which I suppose is one step above a lapsed Catholic. So I've always had this niggle, particularly since I moved to Germany, that there's something that still hasn't been resolved. So this book was really my attempt to say, right, can I have a parting, an honest parting from Catholicism? Like a lot of people in Ireland have just walked away, but I just needed to settle the accounts. And to be honest, I'm still trying to settle those accounts. I would separate Catholic institution, particularly hierarchy, from Catholic faith. And I was in Sweden last week and I was in a graveyard in Uppsala. It was the grave of Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the Swedish former Secretary General of United Nations, and I think he was one of the greatest faith seekers of the modern era, and he described faith as the marriage of God and the soul. And I'm single, but I quite like the idea of that marriage, so I'm still seeking, but I think whether you're a practicing Catholic or a lapsed Catholic, we were all Catholic at some description at some point, and my book is trying to say we were all there. Let's not pretend we weren't there. Why don't we talk about what happened and how did we get from where we were to where we are? So hopefully this evening's discussion will be part of that.
Yeah, there's a sentence, I think, in your book, one of many, countless, wonderfully incisive sentences that capture just in a few words a shift or a move. And one that struck me was in terms of where the Catholic Church is at, an encounter with a priest who wonders how, in the blink of an historical eye, the Catholic majority has been reduced to a modest, even mocked minority. And Mary, you have a description in your book of an encounter with a group of women in Ennis, which I'd just like to quote briefly. In 2019, I met with a small group of women in Ennis, County Clare, to discuss the waning of what was once called Catholic Ireland. This group of 4 women were in their 40s and early 50s. They were all married and had children. They were sensible, educated, thoughtful and responsible citizens in a medium-sized Irish town that had international links through its proximity to Shannon Airport and a deep hinterland of Irish culture. Clare was once reckoned to be the most Republican of counties in the 26 counties of the Irish state and also amongst the most Catholic. All 4 of the women who participated in the discussion had been brought up as Catholics within practicing Catholic families, where the rosary was usually, though not always, part of the family ritual, and the parents had been more or less conscientious believers. All had gone to faith schools, yet none of the 4 were now believing or practicing Catholics. How has it come to this?
And I thought what was interesting too about these 4 women was that none of them had a bad experience. None of them had been abused by a priest. None of them had been treated horribly by nuns. They, in fact, Bree, the woman who arranged it for me, she said, you know, the local priest is wonderful. He's so nice. He's really, really kind and good to people. And a young man, committed suicide, and the family didn't want a religious service, but the priest just said, just use the church as a space, do whatever you like. And that they were also terrifically good to an immigrant family, an Iraqi family who were in trouble. And so, I mean, she actually praised the pastoral gifts, but she still didn't see any space in her life for faith. Interestingly, she had other things to replace it with. She thought, for example, I think this may be a theme in modern life, that climate change and saving the planet was a kind of purpose in life, which was important to her. And she thought that things like community singing could replace sort of going to church where there is a community. So to me, that was kind of a significant meeting.
Derek, you went back, I think you went to was it the National Library or the Catholic Library, and you took out some of the books that formed the basis of your own religious education, such as it was. Might the weaknesses of that system, as you look back on it now, might that have something by way of an explanation to offer?
Yes, I was born in 1977, so I went to primary school in the 80s, and looking back at those books, all this anger came back at the stupidity, from my mind, of these books. I felt they were moronic. This was the early 80s attempt. It was experiential learning. It was about getting away from the catechism and learning by rote and so on, and it was about sort of bringing sort of religious experience into everyday life that people could associate with. And I was a teenage Reformation obsessive. I was just found Martin Luther fascinating. I wanted to know about the clash of ideas. I wanted to know about the intellectual end of Catholicism, which I didn't even realize, I wasn't actually ever sure existed until I went to Germany. In Ireland, I felt it was very much a Catholicism that was of the place, of the land, of the people, of the history. It was a little bit too pastoral for my taste, and I think by the time I got into the 80s, it was getting quite tired. But for fairness, I went to people, Maura Hyland, I think was her name, from Veritas, and I said, what was going on with these books? I found them really stupid. And she said, well, we were between a rock and a hard place. We were the last of three stools. She said there used to be three layers of faith transmission in Ireland. You had church, you had the home, and you had religious instruction. And she said, by the time you came along, everything was balancing on our books. And if everything else had already broken down, all you needed was that last thing to collapse. And it was already gone. So I think I got the last gasp. You know, I came along too late to have had the belt of the crozier, but I was still old enough to sort of sense that there was something important there, I think, for European history, if nothing else. And so, yeah, I'm still a bit of a Reformation obsessive. Living in Germany helps. You know, I always say to people, why are you obsessed with Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones? Read about the Reformation. This happened. This is a battle for control of power of people's minds and hearts and land. It was about money. It was about everything. And I think once you get into that, that's, for many people, I think, could be a way back into Catholicism, or Christianity, even if it is just, let's say, as a sociological, historical idea. But I think from my taste, and again, this is only my subjective experience, I just felt there was a huge intellectual poverty in the Catholic experience in Ireland, which I've now realized, thanks to generous people in the Jesuits and elsewhere, there was always pockets of it. But living elsewhere, I think, has made me cling on to Catholicism more than if I'd been left here with sort of the residual sort of Veritas schoolbook Catholicism that I remember.
I'm not sure I'm going to give you this. It'll probably fall apart anyway if I try to hand it over to you. Some of our audience may remember the Green Catechism. I think this is my copy. My name is kind of scribbled on it, and there are X's and O's on the back of it, and some of the illustrations are...
Read out the first question and see how many people can answer it by rote.
For confirmation, your starter for 2. I was confirmed by Dr. Michael Brown. One of you you elevated him to the position of Archbishop. I'm not sure which of you it was. I think one of you elevated Connie Lucy in Cork to Archbishop. The other elevated Michael Brown to the position of Archbishop, and neither of them reached that stature, even though both, I suspect, believed they were deserving of it. But in any event, for confirmation, I had to know off by heart the first 49 pages of this. So
we should be testing you, Sean.
That's up as far as question 186. But sorry if I can find the question 1. And all the prayers are there. Yeah. Question 1: Who made the world?
God made the world.
Yeah. Who is God? Correct, Mr. McCardle. Why do we call God our Father? We call God our Father because he gave us life and provides for us with fatherly care. It wasn't beaten into us, but certainly, it was a matter of pride and compulsion, I suppose, that, and the people who knew it off best were generally put in the front row where his lordship would do the examining. And anyway, it was a basis for what a lot of people had by way of religious formation in primary school up to what, the age of 12, 13, 14?
Yeah. I mean, I want. It's interesting that Derek talks about his formative years in the 1980s, and I actually agree that I think that a lot of the material that I was seeing in the 90s was terribly soppy. It was sort of bunny rabbit religion. Oh, we were all wonderful. And
Butterfly, sign of new life.
And everything like that.
Yeah.
Whereas I suppose I, being born in 1944, after all, was very much formed by an older formation, and I wouldn't say that Catholicism, that I got the idea that it lacked intellectual depth, because I think actually Moira Cruz O'Brien wrote a wonderful autobiography called The Same Age as the State, and she writes about, I think she had several uncles who were priests, and they were all terrific scholars. And they knew Greek and.
That's right. It was Monsignor de Bruyne. He was
That's
president
right.
of the University in
Wonderful.
Galway. Yeah.
Her uncle Paddy, who was sounded like a wonderful man, and spent the last night of Sean McDiarmid's life in prison. He spent it literally in the arms of Paddy Brown, who stayed with him all night before he faced the firing squad in 1916. And that was a generation of really very well-educated Catholics, very, very well-educated people who were very scholarly and so on. And there was that sense. My own mother had a little bit of this, in the sense that, she would have, my father had been at Jesuit schools and so on, and he was much older. My father was actually born in 1877, which is a very, very long time ago. But my mother loved to have some of these Jesuit friends of my father's visit the house, and she would always say, "Oh, don't you? He's read all of Balzac, So there was that, and especially an admiration, by the way, for French intellectuals of any kind, for French, the whole link with continental Europe, and the whole idea of course, people like Jacques Maritain came into all this. So I did get a strong sense that there was an intellectual aspect there. But I also got the sense, Catholicism has 57 varieties. Not everybody wants to talk about Søren Kierkegaard all the time. Some people want to have nice, simple Bible stories, if you
But
like.
I can definitely say in suburban Dublin, Northside Dublin, by the 1980s, 1990s, it was just ticking over. I think even it was, I knew there was more there. And so reading you or reading other books has showed me that it's far more interesting than perhaps its reputation is now. But there was a pay and pray element to it, and I think the less people knew, the happier some people in the hierarchy were. And also, you come from a middle class background, Mary. I come from more working class background. I think confidence and class consciousness does play a role there.
And yet, though, I mean, okay, you were only 2 at the time, but in 1979 was the year of the Pope's visit to Ireland. 1.25 million turning out in the Phoenix Park. A group of journalists, I was among them. There was an engagement up in, I think it was in the Papal Nunciature, but they sang "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow." Now, I think it had as much to do with alcoholic intake as it might have to do with I don't know if the lady nodding in the middle was there as well, but anyway, there was a kind of an exuberance about that, and there was Knock and there was Drogheda, and the Catholic Church and Limerick indeed, and did I mention Galway, and Clonmacnoise and Maynooth. He was cheered to the rafters by seminarians and religious of all kinds, and the decline. Well, I mean, you would say, look, and maybe the first referendum on abortion, which came, just 4 years after that, was a reflection of the confidence that was there on the part of do you call it the Catholic Church? Do you call it members of the Catholic laity? But it was carried by 2-1 majority, and it was. And there was no doubt about it. I was starting to cover current affairs and politics at that stage. Politicians were very, very careful about engaging in any kind of a critical way with the hierarchy. And I was talking to a friend of mine recently who was growing up. He was growing up in Galway at that time. He would be in his mid to late 50s now. And he's an atheist, as it happens, but he said he was an altar boy in Salt Hill, and they had 10 teams of 12 altar boys, as part of that parish. So, and it came apart very, very quickly, you'd have to say.
Yes, but you've pointed out some inconvenient truths there that some people in Ireland, including in the media industry in which I work, would prefer to ignore. That the ban on abortion wasn't imposed by Rome. Irish people voted for it, just as they voted to get rid of it. That's something people like to forget. And the papal visit, people went because they wanted to be there. People were happy. And they were chastising people. I know Morris, who runs Books Upstairs, another fine establishment in Dublin, he had people come into his bookshop in 1979 attacking him for having his shop open on the day. It was a perfectly normal day. It wasn't a holiday. And he joked to me and he said, I wonder how many of the people who are in my bookshop today in 2018 when Pope Francis was there, I wonder how many of them were the ones who were coming in here attacking me back then. So what I was trying to do with the book is we were all there, and there was a very different Ireland at that time. And it was important for somebody of my generation, as you said, too, at the time, to understand it, to respect the feelings at the time, because if you just poo-poo it and dismiss it and mock those people, you're actually just kind of repeating how, let's say, people of a non-religious persuasion were being treated back then. And I would say, to quote Oscar Hammerstein in South Pacific, you've got to be carefully taught. And I think these days in Ireland, we need to be very careful that lessons of, attacking people, denouncing people, shutting people down, what we would now today call cancelling people, that isn't just a flipped version, an Alice in Wonderland version of what was going on by Catholic hierarchy and their allies back in the day.
Mary, you quote in your book an American Jesuit sociologist, B.F. Beaver, if I think I pronounce his name correctly, as doing some sort of, I don't know what the statistically reliable basis of it was, but, or otherwise, but apparently some 90% of people he surveyed agreed that the church is the greatest force for good in Ireland today. That would have been in the 60s?
I think that was 68, yes.
And 80% disagreed with the suggestion that the church is out of date.
Yes.
I thought it would be good to read just a passage from Kevin Whelan's book, Landscape Religion, Landscape and Settlement in Ireland, from Patrick to the Present, because... if I can find it now, sorry, where he talks about how things changed very, very quickly. And yes, he talks about, I suppose this is by way of making a point that maybe a bit like the sower going out to sow the seed, some of the seed landed on shallow ground, and maybe in Ireland it was maybe as shallow as it was in many places. But he talked about... and this is, forgive me for reading a slightly lengthy passage, but it says that unlike its European counterparts, 19th century Irish Catholicism was never required to pay a political reckoning for its stances within a state regime that was hostile to it. It escaped the fate of its European counterparts, who lost support for at best not resisting and at worst supporting fascist regimes in the mid-20th century. However, the Irish Church eventually paid a severe accumulated price for uncontested power when a rapidly transforming Irish economy, society and state detached itself from the church-state consensus in the 1990s. An institutionally rigid Catholicism had calcified in Ireland, severed from its Gaelic roots in the name of Romanisation. It installed a smug and domineering leadership style that sidelined the laity, marginalised, condescended and mistreated women, promoted a prim pernickety piety rather than spirituality, scorned intellectual debate, and inflicted routine cruelty in the name of unchallenged power and prestige within an all too docile flock. Unable to resist the knocker's ball that hit it in the 1990s, this brittle construction crumbled as it deserved to crumble. Letterfrack, Tuam, Golden Bridge, Cloyne, Ferns and too many others generated their own litany of shame. A hurt child is always and only a hurt child, and the abyss gaped open, the abyss, as opposed to the abyss gaped open the second that this was forgotten. The tragedy of the evil was compounded by the fact that it was inflicted most on the weak, the vulnerable, the fragile, and the timid, the female, the poor, and the marginalised. A class element was always in play. The Catholic middle class escaped, but they also shut their eyes, their mouths, and their hearts.
Very strong. I mean, this is a very interesting book, because the other side of this book is that it takes a long view since the evangelization of Ireland by Patrick, and he really shows that every square foot of this country is embedded with Christianity. That's the other side of that book. It is so strong. It is the island of saints and scholars. And if you look back on that long history, it is extraordinary. And that is something that I think we should be more aware of, and we should be knowledgeable about, and we should see that as part of our culture. I mean, his analysis is right, and it's good, and it's just. And Derek has also written very well about the whole abuse thing. But a lot of analysis about Irish failings do not take into context a wider world, in a way, it seems to me. We do need a little bit of comparative anthropology on some of these issues, and the whole of the West went secular. It wasn't confined to Ireland. There's a wave of secularity has passed through the Western world. So that's one side. So his attribution that it is the failings of the Catholic Church that has caused the secularity, I don't think that holds up to examination if you compare it to other cultures. Stephen Bullivant wrote a very good book called Mass Exodus, which is about the people leaving the churches all over the Western world, and the liberal Protestant churches have lost even more. Derek has recently been in Sweden. Something like, I don't know, is it 2% of the Swedes ever go to church? Denmark, the same thing. Even though the church is actually established in Denmark, it's part of the Danish constitution. Nevertheless, so I think we do have to look further and look at other things. And if you look at things like cruel treatment, for example, of unmarried mothers, indeed a very serious subject, and I think should be highlighted and written about. It also occurred in other countries. Jane Robinson's study of British social history in the family way absolutely chronicles the stigmas against unmarried mothers in Britain right up to 2015. And I think we do have to not constantly say, we were the worst in the world, we were the most terrible country in the world because bad and cruel things happened. Bad and cruel things happen in lots of places.
I would disagree slightly with you on that, and also what the guy in the book said. First of all, I would say we want to be the best. So to say that we were as bad as other people, that's kind of like a whataboutism. I was like, everywhere I went to interview people, they always say, well, what's it like here and what's it like there? And I said, well, I don't really care. I'm here to talk about Ireland. And we have there's often a notion, why don't we look over there? And anything to not look at ourselves. So I'm always slightly wary of saying, well, everywhere was treating children to a point, but Ireland was treating children to a point, and it still is treating children to a point that is not really in keeping with any Catholic teaching or Christian teaching anywhere. His book, I think he makes an interesting sweeping statements, and it reads very well, and I agree with his analysis to a point, but he's making this mistake that many of us do, and I think we're unconsciously carrying on something that we've been taught by Irish Catholicism, which is he's talking about them, he's talking about the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church was always Irish. Irish Catholicism, I have priests who take issue with that. They say, no, it's Roman Catholicism. And I would say the Catholic Church was us. And my book was generally trying to suggest to people, we did this to ourselves. There was not some evil alien overlord that arrived, used hypnosis and mind control to do certain things to us. The tragedy of our past is that it's our past. And of course, there was history of colonialization. Of course, there's trauma. Of course, there was, the Catholicism came after the famine, offered consolation in desolation. But the cruelty, as well as the beauty, was ours. It traumatized people, no doubt. But to write what he's writing is they did something to us. I think that's sort of the initial post-abuse narrative, which, is important for abuse survivors to realize that we are now hearing them, that their shame is not their shame, it is our shame, it is the country's shame. But to talk about us and them, I'm just so tired of hearing that, because the Catholic Church, so many people, they're always surprised when I say, you do realize priests are Irish passport holders. They're Irish citizens. We're unconsciously still putting them, we used to put them up on a pedestal, and now we're putting them in a isolation chamber. And until we start realizing that we're actually continuing a church narrative by thinking that way, I think this type of analysis, it makes people feel good about themselves because we've othered them. But, for me, that sounds a bit like priests and religious are such a provocation to so many people. We have to put them almost out of sight, beyond the pale. But we used to do that with single mothers and putting women into institutions. And I'm in no way comparing what was done then but done now. But there's a pattern, and there's a pattern of provocative people who are at odds with what we perceive ourselves to be. We have to other them and get rid of them. So this kind of analysis troubles me a little. It's a bit simplistic.
I'm sure if Kevin was here, he might wish to take issue, and he'd be well able to do that too. It struck me, actually, I was in my car driving across town this morning and listening to Morning Ireland. You got two examples of the two sides of the church coin, if you like. One you had, and how it's perceived. You had Claire Keegan talking about her book, which is now shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and that's a book about how, as I understood it, because I haven't read it yet, a young woman was treated, in a
Magdalene home, yeah.
Or I'm not sure if it was a mother and baby home or a Magdalene home, but anyway, it showed the harsh side and the unchristian side that was there. In those situations. And then you had the parish priest of the village where young Jack de Bromhead had his funeral mass this morning, and he was able to reflect on the love and the care and the support that family was receiving, if you like, through the Christian community there in that part of Waterford. So there you had it, two sides of, that both of those, if you like, elements come from the same source, if you like, of sort of the Catholic experience, and it's still there. And I suppose we all have seen examples of. I certainly saw them as a youngster in school. Sort of overbearing power, and I mean this in national school because I had a much better experience. I went to the Jazz in Galway, and a lot of very fine teachers and priests and brothers were there. Not all of them likable, but however, but you saw people who just march into classrooms and lather youngsters with on the face with the back of their leather gloves because they were perceived to have given some cheek, and there was that, and there's no doubt about it. I mean, you were almost trained to kind of salute priests when you came across them in the street, and I suppose there was that deference that was over deference.
Undue deference is what Yvonne Murphy called it when I spoke to her. But I think what Mary and myself are trying to do in our books is we're just trying to let both realities in. It's not a binary. It wasn't one or the other. It was both. And I think if we're going to be mature in looking back, and Mary brings a greater wealth of experience to this and life lived, but can we allow both in, and can we see ourselves in that story? We have terrible perpetrators of violence, sexual, physical. We have the victims, survivors here. Can we locate ourselves between those two extremes? Do we want to even put ourselves in there?
I agree with what Sean says about whataboutery, Conor Cruise O'Brien's great phrase. It's not nothing that you compare exculpates from the crimes or the injustices against particular people, but you still have to keep a certain perspective and a context. I mean, since I've just this week. I've been stopped in the street in Dublin. I've been stopped in buses in Dublin of people saying to me, look, my uncle served in Zimbabwe for 40 years. He then went and served in Mexico as a priest for 20 years. He looked after people. He was a wonderful man. He comes back to Ireland, and what does he get? He gets this cold narrative all the time about toxic Catholicism, and that we, and that it was really that we were like the Nazis, which is one of the things that Niall O'Dowd wrote, or John Banville, who constantly says, that Irish Catholicism was as bad as the Turks, what the Turks did to genocide Armenians, is constant. And I'm stopped again and again, stopped by a woman yesterday saying, my aunt she was a nun in Bangalore for 50 years. She served those people. She loved India. She was a good shepherd nun, and she was a wonderful woman. She came back to Ireland, and she faces the same thing. A third person came to me and said, my sister has been serving in Kenya. She's been looking after victims of drought for years and years. And, we talk about the silence of those who were abused, and that silence should be broken. But there's also a silent majority of people who remember hundreds and so many good people of faith, many good men and women who were sincere and honest believers, and not, as Emer MacLeod said, hypocrites and bigots. Who were good and true believers, and they wanted to do their best and so on. And they too should be part of the picture.
Oh, completely. I agree with you.
When we look at something like horrible beatings that you mention, or that sort of attitude that you encountered at school, again, let me just draw your attention to a book written by an Englishman recently called Sad Little Men, which was an account of English public schools in which people, right up to David Cameron was thrashed at Eton, by the way. And that these schools attracted actually men who were absolute sadists, and these things have happened. And even recently, A.N. Wilson, who's an author I know very well, he's just brought out an autobiography, and he writes about being sent to boarding school when he was a young boy, and the headmaster of this boarding school beat him really, really sadistically and masturbated while he beat him, and his wife was there as well, so it wasn't a celibacy issue. So I think, you do have to say there are terrible things happen in many contexts, and it's not just focusing. It's not fair simply to say we were the only people who did this.
And I don't think anybody is suggesting that we were the only people, but nonetheless we are talking about the Irish context. Derek, you spent a considerable time exploring this whole question of child sexual abuse by clerics, and particularly the case of Brendan Smith, which was one that brought down a government in the early to mid-90s. And you, unlike I think a lot of other journalists and writers, you had occasion to conduct, was it 4 conversations with, he's now retired, Cardinal Sean Brady, who was, I think he was a diocesan secretary at the time when the first complaints were being made and examined.
Yes, it was a very fruitful meetings with him. And first of all, I would just say I agree with everything that Mary has said. I met a nun going into the Phoenix Park for the 2018 Pope's visit, and she was a nun from Roscommon who's living in upstate New York. And I said, how do you think the mood is like? What do you think the mood is like? She said, I sense a real old anger. And I said, oh, do you mean like the abuse and so on? Oh, that, of course, as well. But I think there's an older anger in a lot of people in Ireland that we put certain people up on pedestals, and we're angry at ourselves for doing that. Not just because of the abuse of trust and the abuse of children and so on, but at ourselves for allowing ourselves to be part of that. So I think it's a lashing out at other people or ignoring people because not able to deal with themselves. So that's just, so in that sense, I agree with you. I think perhaps there's a chance to mature as a country to deal with that. And that's what my book is trying to go beyond blaming other people. And what about your own responsibility for your own history in your own country? As regards to Sean Brady, I was interested in talking to him because every interview I saw with him was always quite combative. I mean, at the time, there were these terrible revelations. Everyone remembers the story, I'm sure, but Sean Brady had a unique insight into this. Brendan Smith had been abusing priests, abusing children, but because he was from an order, the Norbertines, the diocesan bishop had no immediate access to him. He couldn't get rid of him or put him aside or whatever. But what nobody knew at the time that John Brady was interviewing these boys, writing up the notes, sent a report to his bishop saying, I believe these boys, something needs to be done. And after that, he said he just forgot. But he also forgot to tell us afterwards when Brendan Smith started appearing. So you had this almost Shakespearean drama. He had come back after years working in Rome, and literally weeks after he came back, Brendan Smith's face is on the front of the paper. And slowly, Brendan Smith's story was coming out, but Sean Brady's star was rising. And I think it was a failing on his part. He chose not to remember. He chose not to tell us that he was involved in that story. But by not doing that, and I think there was a certain amount of quiet ambition at play, it all ended up coming out, and I think it's really ruined his reputation for a lot of people. But I wanted to meet him myself, and I met him for many times, and he explained growing up, basically he was institutionalized from a very young age. He went to I think it was a junior seminary, in Cavan, then he went to St. Patrick's and he spent his time living in Rome. He just didn't really, he seemed to be like a man from Cavan, my uncles knew him, just didn't really have a huge access to his own emotional reality, which is perhaps not unusual for that generation. But later on, he just couldn't see the problem. And he knew there was a problem, and he knew he should have done certain things. But he didn't.
Yeah, I'm wondering, just at that time, I mean, might there have been an element of you applying the standards of later years to his actions at a time when he just wouldn't have been expected to take action, we'll say, was it in the 1970s when these complaints
No, well, that's...
to finish, the reason I'm asking you that is because a friend of his, a former classmate of his who I was friendly with, he's now dead and I won't name him, but he said, look, and the guy was ordained, though he left the priesthood subsequently, he said, look, I was in that class in Maynooth, there were about 70 guys in it, he said, not one of them would have done any different to what Sean Brady did.
Of course, and I was very careful. I sensed in all of the interviews there was a standard of today being applied to then. On the other hand, I would say, was there any time when sexual abuse of children was okay? So that's the two sides of that argument. And in the end, I won't go into the details of my meetings with him, but in the end, I did come away from our meetings wondering, why is he such a provocation to us? Is it because he is the ultimate representation of, kind of the focus of fury could be focused on this one person, the ultimate clerical company man who was, to hell with the children, protect the institution. That's kind of a lot of everything sort of like magnetically went to him and he had to weather that. Is he a provocation of that? Or, as you say, is he a provocation because he reacted to this knowledge of child abuse at the time the way you would have reacted, and you would have reacted, the Gardaí would have reacted and did react, social workers would have reacted. So we put him and people like him on a pedestal. He was no better than us. Is he a provocation because he was so clerical in his approach or because he was so Irish in his approach? And that really is the tragedy of Sean Brady. We'll never fully know. He did such tremendous good. He's deeply loved in Cavan, and I was anxious to show that in the book. He has been turned, a bit like Brendan Smith, into a symbol for everything we don't like in the clergy. But I would also argue in the chapter also everything that we didn't like in ourselves.
You brought out very well, Derek, I thought also, that notion that, and that's always there in Ireland, I think, that there is a bit of regional loyalty always to people. If the people in Cavan, as with Sean Quinn, an interesting parallel there, that nevertheless there is that local, there's a bit of tribal loyalty always in Ireland, that he's one of our own and we're not going to, that we're going to see the good side of him. I mean, one of the things that your book brought out again was really the shocking aspect of the Brendan Smith saga was that people knew again and again about his problems and that he'd been expelled from all these countries and everything like that.
The only people who tolerated him was Ireland.
But I just want to say, again, going back to my comparative situation, the British Independent Inquiry into Child Abuse, which is a huge, big inquiry that they've been doing, and it will be published fully in October 2022. One of the things that they're looking at children who were abused very often in council care, for example, under social workers, in the care of the state and the care of the local council. And they're focusing, for example, in a local council like Lambeth, they're dealing with over 700 claims of abuse by residents. And one of the things that come up in this theme the whole time is that these councils knew that certain individuals were liable to abuse. They covered up, as the BBC covered up, Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris. They moved the people on who they knew had paedophile tendencies, and they knowingly employed adults suspected of sexual abuse. So there you get that same pattern.
Indeed, but I don't think people held the BBC, although I have a huge respect for the BBC, to the same moral standard as the Catholic Church held itself. And I think we can all agree that whataboutism is dangerous when you're dealing with an institution that can sexually abuse people, spiritually abuse people, destroy lives, and recruit the entire neighbourhood to act in sort of a clan liability. And we've seen that in books by John Boyne, Claire Keegan.
It's a very good book, that Claire Keegan's book.
Although interestingly, I won't spoil it, but the book ends one chapter too soon. And everyone is identifying with a figure in it who's very courageous, morally courageous, but he is living in a town of moral cowards, like a lot of us would have been in the 1970s and 80s in dealing with the nuns. The nuns could destroy your life, the nuns and so on. And it's fascinating how everyone associates with the one good man. And also, Claire doesn't go one chapter further to tell us what really would have happened. But those are just my
Speaking of
observations.
nuns, Derek, you also had a very interesting engagement with the head of the Mercy Sisters in Baggot Street there, and I think his sister, is it Mary Reynolds her name?
Yes.
And again, you get a real strong sense of the good and the bad in regard to their legacy.
Yes, I mean, I'm young enough that I perhaps didn't go through some of the extremes. I went to Vincentian school, but most of Vincentians were gone at that stage. But, you know, we have to admit the good and the bad, the black and the white, and all of the grey in between. And I'm of my generation, I'm perhaps the blessing of a late birth. I'm able to accept that. And I would hope with my book, I'm not blaming, I'm trying to look for responsibility. And I saw Liz Murphy here from Amory here, and we had a great meeting talking about all of those women that you spoke about who worked abroad, getting little thanks, almost expected to do it. Well, that's what you signed up for. And in my acknowledgements, I said, my endless respect to Ireland's many empathetic, educated and energetic religious, without whom Ireland would and will be a poorer place. And the Sisters of Mercy, they did some terrible things, they did some wonderful things. We have to accept that. And the achievements of the Sisters of Mercy are staggering. The damage by the Sisters of Mercy is staggering. And the damage they did to their own sisters is fascinating. I asked Liz, I said, Mary Reynolds, I said, why did none of the women who were running these laundries or whatever, why did they never go to court? And she said, well, because we put them in there. We locked them up with those women. We had no idea what we were doing to our own, putting them in those laundries. So we were abusing them just the way as these women were being abused. So they, you could argue about they took a rather corporate approach. They got in PR. They were moving assets around and so on. They did all of that as well, but in a very Irish way. Is that very Irish? Is that very Catholic? So again, I tried to show, on Baggot Street, you've got the Sisters of Mercy, and at the other end, you had you had Yvonne Murphy and her inquiry talking about undue deference that we showed to these institutions. So this is all Ireland. I mean, Ireland is the Book of Kells, and Catholic Ireland is also the Murphy Report. And until we accept both of those volumes on our shelves as our Catholic Christian legacy, I think we're still slightly deluding ourselves.
It's just another line in Kevin Whelan's book about the legacy that's there. He says that at the First Vatican Council in 1867 to 70, some 30% of the 730 bishops were either Irish or of Irish descent, which is quite the statistic. But Mary, just to go back to something you mentioned John Banville earlier, and I think in your book you say, look, John Banville says, but we all knew. And you said, well, John, we didn't all know. Why didn't you tell us at the time when you were in the Irish press?
John Banville was a journalist in the Irish press in 1970 when I was. I mean, if he knew, why didn't he write a piece about it,
Again, that's something we'll have to leave hanging there. But one thing I certainly noticed, and it's really stark to read any segments or volumes of the Ryan Report. I know you did, but one that particularly interested me was the one concerning the St. Joseph's. We used to call it the industrial school in Galway, in Lower Salt Hill, St. Joseph's, run by the Christian Brothers for people from. There would have been, I suppose, people from. Well, in the language of the time, orphans, broken homes, sent there by the courts. We used to play them in football matches, and there were a couple of Christmases. My parents invited them. One of the boys came and stayed in our house, but it would put the heart crossways in you to read some of those sections that, I mean, some of the neighbours in that area of Lower Salt Hill, from the screams they heard of the young boys, they wrote to the Bishop of Galway suggesting that something should be done and looking for action, and it didn't happen. And there were people who knew they mightn't have been in a position. I mean, they probably felt they were doing as much as they could to ask his lordship to intervene, but nothing seemed to happen. And
in hindsight, they know that they didn't. I had a taxi driver who used to drive women from the mother and baby home on the Navan Road into St. James's Hospital for checkups, and he used to buy them cigarettes along the way. Those were the days. Pregnant women smoking. But he drove me to the Magdalene Day at the Oris, and he said he just wanted to talk about it. He says, I was working. I needed, the job. I needed the money. We had the contract to drive these women back and forth. Could I have done more? Should I have done more? And I really wanted to stay with him because there's nowhere for him to go. And I'd be quite hopeful that this new institution in the
memorial,
yes, that will open those debates. But you actually said let's leave that dangling. I would say no, let's not leave it dangling. We have 3 journalists here, and as far as I know, Michael Viney of my newspaper is one of the few who consistently was writing about institutional abuse back in the 60s. It was brought up in the Dáil, it was dropped by the Dáil. So,
and Patrick O'Gorman in the Galway Advertiser in the early 70s was doing the same about the home St. Anne's up in Taylor's Hill.
You could probably count on one hand the amount of journalists who are doing it. And if I'd had more time for my book, I really wanted to look into that issue. What weren't we seeing as journalists? So, and if we are sweeping in judgment of other people in Ireland, what do we as journalists what are we missing now? Why did we miss what we saw then? Or did we choose not to see, like the rest of the country? And so it's knowing, not knowing, not knowing, not to know, and so on. It's difficult. And I think if you could take the anger out of the argument and you could encourage people to speak without fear of having their head knocked off, that perhaps we could have that debate.
The other thing is context of time, as well as the things were accepted. Things that were considered acceptable then are not considered acceptable now. For example, beating children was considered acceptable. And indeed, one of the founders of the Free State, Jenny Wise Power, greatly admired as a progressive woman, she was in favour of flogging of criminals. When my own aunt in Sandymount, a terribly kind woman who gave money to the protection, the Irish Society against Cruelty to Children, and also to animal charities, she approved of the procedure in the Isle of Man, where juvenile delinquents were flogged, and she thought this was a very useful and humane thing. People did think different things, and this is not an exculpation again, but again, if you're trying to explore, trying to understand, trying to look at contexts, look at a lot of things. Look at attitudes to race, for example. When I first started to working in London and in the 1960s. Of course, the N-word was pervasive. There were packies and there were micks and spicks and frogs and all the rest of it. And there was a lot of, and Australians were thoroughly abused, as far as I remember, because they were considered to be wild drinkers. So there were all those kind of things that you have to try, and it's very hard to look at a context. Though I might add, by the way, that one of the greatest reformers against beating children was Cyril Daly in this country, who was indeed a devout Irish Catholic and a very strong campaigner for pro-life as well. So there you've got another kind of mixture of people who were certainly good people who were trying to change things.
I think that's why your book is so valuable. It provides that perspective, a calm pointing out the nature of the time. You can reflect and you can mourn the way things were, but you actually, the way we were. And I think that's what makes your book so valuable. For me and my generation, I look back and I tried to look at, my book was called, slightly ironically, The Best Catholics in the World. So using a Catholic or a Christian yardstick, how did we measure up? Rather than comparing ourselves to what were the British doing, what were the French doing, what were we as Irish Catholics doing in a Catholic sense of the word? And a therapist friend of mine in Germany, he said, remind me, what is the most important commandment? He's not Catholic. What's the most important Christian commandment? And I poked around my brain and I finally came up with, I think it's something like, you must love God with all your heart and love your neighbour as yourself. And he said, precisely. Now, what if the Catholic Church in Ireland did not teach you to love yourself? And that has stayed with me. And I think a failure of love is a failure of Christianity. You can just pack up and go home. And I think the failure of love and the anger and the brutality that Irish Catholicism seemed to imbibe, I would prefer to judge Ireland by the standards it set itself. And I think the tragedy is that there was huge achievement and huge failure, and accepting those two, love your neighbour as you love yourself. And that really has stuck with me, because I think that is the greatest failure that we've had. And it would be great as time moves on and as people are still around to talk, but a certain amount of time has passed, that we can have that discussion about the context of society as it was, but that lack of love that made all of this horror possible.
I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, you should love your neighbour and love your enemy, because sometimes they're the same thing.
One of the people I tend to follow in the Catholic Church is an American Bishop, Robert Barron. I don't know if any or many of you have heard of him. He spoke here during the families gathering 4 years ago, and he set up this, I suppose you'd call it an institute, Word on Fire, but he writes a lot. And I remember I interviewed him, we were covering the last papal election, and we'd been looking for him, and he was a bit hard to get, but I walked out the day after the election, and there he was standing beside that obelisk in the middle of St. Peter's Square, so he came away and did an interview with me. But he's written this letter to a suffering church, a bishop speaks on the sexual abuse crisis. And by way of, like, if you're tempted to be pessimistic, or if you think things are bad, just a brief extract. The office of Peter has been filled by a number of saintly and accomplished men over the ages, but it has been occupied by far more questionable figures as well. The 10th and 11th centuries were particularly characterized by papal corruption. Arguably, the worst pontiff in history was John XII, who reigned from 955 to 964. His wickedness was so egregious that bishops and cardinals endeavoured to remove him. Gathered in synod, they accused him of sacrilege, simony, perjury, murder, adultery, and incest. Summoned to defend himself against these charges, John instead excommunicated his accusers and executed judgment on them, striking off the hand of one, scourging another, and removing the nose and ears of a third. Pope John XII died in the act of coitus, either from apoplexy or by the murderous hand of an offended rival. So things have been worse. Mary?
Sean, can I just say to that, the worst pope actually was the Borgia pope.
Oh, well, he gets a mention 2 pages later.
But he had the best taste in art. So God worked in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform.
Mary Kelly, and also my thanks to you, Mary. And the wonderful book it's being launched she is Sabina Higgins. I was going to say the president's wife. She's married to the president.
Sabina
Coyne next week here, and Derek Scally, both really well worth reading. And
I'm the publisher of Columba Books, and I just want to say thank you to you all for coming out tonight. I want to especially thank Mary Kenny, Derek Scally, and Sean O'Rourke. Thank you very much.